under is 20. And it's the last minutes of the game. And your team's already up by 19. Okay? And you're at the free throw line. And somebody whispers in your ear, psst, hey, give you $1,000 if you miss both these free throws. And you miss both free throws. You've already won the game. Your team's now going to the playoffs because they've won the game, but they won it by 19, not 20. So you didn't match the spread. No harm, no foul, right? Wrong. Gambling affects the game. Now, how much will gambling affect the games in the future? Only time will tell. Now, I understand that gambling is a key revenue source for leagues and the media and individual states. Now, that's during a time when every revenue source is vital. Now, the thing is gambling has always been a key potential revenue source. Always. Okay? But because memories of the Black Sox scandals were so fresh and were passed down from generation to generation, that's why Bart Giamatti, who was the commissioner of baseball back then, came down so hard on Pete Rose. Now, leagues were incredibly cautious about touching the hot stove. They didn't want to get involved. Then arrived technology that makes gambling frighteningly simple, revealing it as perhaps an even bigger moneymaker that anyone had anticipated. That, combined with that Supreme Court decision back in 2018 that allowed gambling, flung the door wide open. Now the sports world is plunged into gambling with both feet. Trouble is coming, my opinion. Now, it's all fun and games, that is, until it isn't. Now, sports and gambling are ultimately intertwined. In fact, they always have been. Now more so than ever. Let's go internationally. Long featured match in Britain, for instance. Sports betting was expected or expedited to the American mainstream, okay? Because you used to always be able to bet on soccer games all the time. People loved to do it. People in this country loved to do it. In fact, the United States, after 2018, had been predicted to soon become the largest sports betting market in the world. But then what happened shortly after 2018? The pandemic. Now, if you don't think that gambling and sports are intertwined, consider an article written by one of my favorite columnists in one of my favorite publications, the Wall Street Journal, columnist Jason Gay. He recently called the pandemic nothing less than the most seismic disruption in the history of sports. Because it's true. Last year, all sports just stopped because of the pandemic. You couldn't play sports. They all stopped. What else stopped then? If you're not playing sports, you're not betting on sports. All sports stopped. Well, almost all. Let's go to Hong Kong. In fact, there was one event that remained operational throughout the whole pandemic, and that was Hong Kong's regular set of horse racing. That had been going on since the 1840s, and there's a fanatical following in gambling-obsessed Hong Kong. Now, according to Deng Xiaoping, who promised the Brits after they handed Hong Kong over to China, Deng Xiaoping said, look, the horses will still run, the stocks will still sizzle, and the dancers will still dance, okay? And they do. And they did. In fact, last year, 2.2 million people attended horse racing events in Hong Kong, placing bets of $16.1 billion. That's according to the Hong Kong Jockey Club, which oversees the territory's races. Now, the club is Hong Kong's largest taxpayer. Think about that. Who pays the most taxes in Hong Kong? The Hong Kong racetrack. More than any corporation. And the city's newspapers, 30% boost in sales before race day as bettors scour the guides for tips. Now, much like Hong Kong, the Jockey Club learned from the city's experience with SARS back in 2003. SARS was not a big deal here, but it was a big deal in Asia. Now, following the SARS outbreak, the Jockey Club formed a pandemic response team. This was 2003, okay, not 2019. They formed a pandemic response team, which was activated shortly after news of a mystery virus came to play. Now, here's what they did. Many of the Jockey Club's employees, they lived near the race course in the outlying area called Sha Tin. Now, one of two tracks it owns and operates in the city. Now, the club implemented strict procedures for entry and exit into its sites, instituted temperature checks, deliveries had to be dropped outside of a cordoned-off area, so they were the first organization to form a bubble. Now, as Hong Kong residents rushed to purchase face masks and the international supply chain tightened, the club's procurement team was given a simple order: do everything you can globally to make sure this thing works. They even got rented private planes to pick up face masks sourced from everywhere in the world, and the measures paid off. No staff members got sick. The lack of sporting events worldwide during the pandemic put the Hong Kong races in a great position because they were able to provide gamblers an event to bet on when there was nothing else available. Think about it. Now, others, like gamblers from companies abroad, they weren't so fortunate. In fact, without sports, there's no sports betting. That was according to Joe Asher. He's the executive chief of the company's U.S. arm. Joe Asher said, "We've got our guys scouring the globe to find sports that we can offer." In other words, there were no major sports, so they had to find something to bet on. You remember this during the pandemic, the worst part of the pandemic, when no sports were being played. And the search turned up some obscure alternatives. One of them was Russian table tennis. Okay, yeah, they still had a professional league that operated. Now, one month, a gambler put down $900, a $900 bet on a parlay of 6 such matches and collected $19,000 in winnings. Another hit a 9-game parlay, which turned $2 into $1,400. Now, part of the popularity of Russian table tennis, according to Asher, is due to the familiarity of the sport. In other words, everybody knows how to play ping pong. So even when there were no sports being played, worth mentioning, gambling was still taking place. I can't bet on an NBA game, so I will just bet on a Russian ping pong tournament. Okay? People really did this. They really did. And it was, to me, strange and odd that I'm a baseball fan, okay? If I can't watch, no, because MLB wasn't going on, but the KBL was going on, Korean Baseball League, because that was going on, I watched Korean baseball, and I enjoyed it because it was baseball. Same rules, same players, not same players, but I mean, some of them were American players, but the same rules. It was the same game. That's different from, I can't bet on my favorite NFL team, so I'm going to bet on Russian table tennis or Hong Kong horse racing. Totally different. That is putting the cart before the horse, the chicken before the egg. Gambling or sports exist because of the gambling. Not gambling exists because of the sport. You follow me? So you think to yourself, well, this can't happen because these sports players are paid big time. What's the biggest event in the spring? It's not the Stanley Cup playoffs. It's not the fact that baseball is coming back. It's March Madness, the NCAA tournament. And you know how many players in this tournament? 64 teams? You know what the payroll for those 64 teams? What is there 20 players on a squad? Let's say there's 10 because I can do the math quicker. So that's 6,400 players, right? No, that's 640 players on a 64 team league. If there's 10 on a team. If there's 20, that's 1,280, okay? 2,800? Nah. It's a lot of players. But you know what the payroll is for those guys? It's zero. And the vast majority of them will never get an NBA contract. Now, consider the following, and this is information from 2014. So the numbers are skewed, but the fact that it's from 2014, 7 years ago, that just means it's that much more prevalent. Okay, so back in 2014, estimates on how much is legally wagered on the NCAA tournament through states licensed sports books in Delaware, Montana, Oregon, and of course, Nevada. $90 to $100 million. And that was in 2014. Now, according to a story in the Dallas Morning News, the tab could have been as high as $227 million. Now, 2 years ago, the LA Times cited an FBI source that more than $2.5 billion was illegally wagered, not legally, but illegally wagered on the NCAA men's basketball tournament. Now, does that illegal gambling include your office brackets? Sure. You don't pay taxes on those winnings, and that's why the government pays attention to it. $2.5 billion in illegal wagering in 2014? That's a lot of money that the government could be getting. If they get 10% of that tax, let's say just 10%, that's $250 million. That's a lot of money there. And that's a one basketball tournament. So you can see why the government is involved in this and why they care. Now, how much is that? Well, compare this to this. What's the other biggest thing that people bet on? The Super Bowl, right? Super Bowl is only $2 billion. NCAA tournament was $2.5 billion. So more money is bet on the NCAA tournament illegally than it is on the Super Bowl. And 100% of all the players who play in that tournament are not paid a nickel. Again, I ask the question, would they accept a bribe? Think about it. That's a big deal. That's a big deal. Now, remember Bert Sugar? He was a big boxing guy, sports guy, and he was one of the first, from what I remember anyway, he was one of the first sportscasters, sports writers to really talk about gambling a lot. In fact, he was fond of saying that horse racing is the only sport that existed because of gambling. And think about it. That's true. Nobody watches a horse race because, wow, I just love to see those horses race. No, they have it because of gambling. If all gambling was illegal, horse racing would stop tomorrow. And one has to wonder if, at least in its present form, isn't the same thing true of March Madness? Does it really exist just because of the gambling? Now, there's an ironic possibility that would likely ruffle the NCAA officials who have historically spent the rest of the year reprimanding people who gamble on college sports, but not so much during the tournament. Now, it's understandable that the tournament is such a popular occasion for wagering money because, after all, people don't follow the tournament, the early rounds anyway, because of the suspense. Now, the Final Four, the Elite Eight, the Sweet 16, those are all very suspenseful. Those are great games to watch. But you don't need 64, I think it's 68 teams now, to be in the playoffs to determine who's the best in the country. I mean, consider this, and this is as of 1914. Okay, that's where I got the numbers for this essay, this part of the essay anyway. The first round of the playoffs is as close to a sure thing as you can find in sports. Now, since the tournament expanded to 64 teams back in 1985 and going on to 68 teams in 2010, in 116 tries, the number 16 seed never beat a number 1. Never. The number 2, 110-6 against the number 15s. In fact, the lowest seed to go all the way in the tournament was a number 8. That was in 85, Villanova. Now, there's a guy named